East of West is a popular genre-defying sci-fi western comic about political rivalries and the end of the world as we know it. We could look at many, and I mean many, different forms of representation in this novel, from the neo-colonial China, to a modern confederacy, to a Louisiana kingdom. But perhaps the most interesting form of representation depicted by writer Jonathan Hickman, illustrator Nick Dragotta, and colorist Frank Martin is how it represents American Indigenous peoples. So, after drinking lots of coffee, rereading volumes 1 through 9 of the series, and annotating it to death, here are my thoughts. Now, because East of West follows a multitude of characters, convoluted, interweaving plot lines, and a revisionist portrayal of American history, I'm going to largely be focusing on the history, conflicts, and representation of the Endless Nation, the centralizing government authority of Indigenous American communities in this universe. Also, as a disclaimer, I want to point out that I am not Indigenous, and this isn't meant to be me justifying or critiquing the graphic novel series as good or bad portrayals of these cultures on a spectrum of quote-unquote Indigenous experience. Rather, I hope to analyze how the creators depict Indigenous characters and whether this reinforces distinctions of an inaccurate Indian caricature or whether it breaks new grounds in how Indigenous Americans are portrayed in the medium. But first, it may be helpful to look back at how Indigenous Americans have been portrayed in the media and more specifically in comics themselves.
The Lone Ranger.
Some of the earliest depictions of Indigenous Americans come from the golden age of comics, in which serialized Western comics, like The Lone Ranger and Detective Comics, mythologized American Western expansion and manifest destiny through a new medium. While some of these comics depicted their Indigenous characters as helpful sidekicks to their white counterparts, they were often built on stereotypical imagery or whitewashed to the point of being more of a representation of U.S. culture than any definable Indigenous community. A common theme that comes from this era is the creation of a dichotomy between the noble Indian and the inhumane savage. Though representations of Indigenous peoples in the medium has largely remained static in terms of archetypes and time period depicted, with Indigenous Americans only being depicted in a colonial past tense, the start of a comic renaissance in the late 1970s and early 1980s brought with it more opportunities for present-day representation. Characters like Thunderbird and Downstar joined the X-Men, Justice League, and other popular established comics, yet most of these characters were either in minor roles, quickly killed off, or defined almost entirely by a mystic interpretation of the monolithic Indigenous American stereotype. The characters often rely almost entirely on native iconography, like headdresses and smoke signals. Comic and media studies scholar Michael Shiashi, an enrolled member of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma and comic enthusiast, argues that this type of representation reinforces iconographic stereotypes and perpetuates the erasure of hundreds of different tribes, saying that
remember that in comic books you have a very limited panel of sequential images to get your message across. And that doesn't necessarily condemn or condone, but many times these artistic individuals take a shortcut. Whether it's the writers or the artists, they say, throw a headdress on them. We've got to make this character instantly Indian for our audience to catch it. So it works for some people, but again, it doesn't celebrate the particular culture.
Although there is no formal rule on how to depict Indigenous characters, which would be problematic in itself, these recycled cliches fail to humanize their Indigenous characters to the same extent as their Anglo-Saxon characters. When depicting Indigenous characters, especially by non-Indigenous writers, it is informative to outline what a piece of media shouldn't do rather than what it should do. Academic Elizabeth Cook Lynn, member of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe, outlines 4 key elements to avoiding spreading, as she calls it, anti-Indianism. Those elements are elements which treats Indians and their tribes as if they do not exist. Second, anti-Indianism is which degenerates, demonizes, and insults being Indian in America. The use of historical events and experience to place the blame on Indians for an unfortunate and dissatisfying history. And finally, anti-Indianism is that which exploits and distorts Indian beliefs and cultures. Thus, when I jumped into East of West, I immediately felt mixed on how the Indigenous Endless Nation was depicted. In some ways, East of West is subversive in its non-static mythologization of Indigenous peoples. Not only are natives central to the present storyline, but the characters actively engage and take part in the narrative, with the Endless Nation being depicted as the most technologically advanced and one of the most politically stable nations in the graphic novel series. Similarly, Indigenous characters are titular to the story, with characters like Wolf and Crow, who start to accompany Death on his search for his son. Yeah, I told you it was weird. Chiveo, the previous chief, who is part of the original group and nation bringing forth the apocalypse, and a brooding tribal council plagued by internal conflict and indecision. Similarly, technology in the Endless Nation, at least aesthetically, merges indigenous spirituality with technological advancements. From the statistical decision analysis programmed, used by the quote-unquote shaman, to the totem-like warships that also act dually as housing. While the creators are not indigenous themselves, and I wouldn't go so far as to label this as indigenous futurism, a term which was coined in 2003 by Professor Grace Dillon and inspired in part by Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, to grossly oversimplify, refers to the growing body of art, media, and worldviews which center and express indigenous perspectives, histories, and ways of knowing in the past, present, and future. Hence, why East of West itself is not indigenous futurism in its own right, its characters and themes do tread the territory. In this respect, East of West is bold, at least compared to other modern popular comics, in how it envisions a future in which the post-United States is shaped and led not by Anglo-Saxon descendants with their Enlightenment principles and free markets, but rather by a unified indigenous nation. Progressing from past stereotypical archetypes of the quote-unquote Indian, the comic presents dynamic and semi-diverse indigenous characters whose integrity, be it culture, spirituality, or technology, benefit the nation rather than being treated as a hindrance in need of erasure, as it was in prior comics. Alrighty, and if you were listening closely, you might have heard me mention that the comics characters were only semi-diverse. Well, what do I actually mean by this? Across the continental United States, there are hundreds and hundreds of recognized and unrecognized tribal nations, each with their own distinct culture, history, religions, and ethnographic territory, yet the comic relies on a universal Indigenous American identity. It's implied that, given the geographic lands and clothing styles of the nation, the tribal government is composed of primarily Plains Indigenous peoples, Lakota specifically, while characters like Cheveo and Wolf are likely descendants of southwestern Puebloan peoples, perhaps the Hopi or Arapaho tribes. It's never made explicit what tribal community beyond the federal Endless Nation these characters are tied to. Similarly, in the comic, we're shown that the nation was created by Red Cloud, a real-life historical figure. In the comic, it's shown how he successfully annexes all of the other tribal nations, becoming the chief of chiefs, and presumably creating nationalism around a more general indigenous identity rather than ethno-specific tribal pride. This may explain why the Endless Nation resembles a modern aristocracy over a unique tribal government, which makes it closer to other liberal nation-states rather than a distinctly anti-colonial identity. And in that, it still perpetuates a false monolithic identity of indigeneity with its characters. This false monolith erases the hundreds and hundreds of other cultures and also reduces its characters to being simple figureheads. And while, to some extent, this is portrayed to be an internal conflict within the tribal council, I think that it's really more emblematic of how East of West fails to accurately and creatively portray indigeneity beyond the bounds of a colonial casement. This colonial encasement or frame may explain why there seems to be a fantasized depiction of spirituality in which some indigenous characters can use a kind of magic, while others cannot. From the very beginning, a select few indigenous characters who are coded or explicitly stated as being quote-unquote more traditional, whatever that might mean, are able to perform magical acts like shapeshifting. The graphic novel also makes a point to show when the Endless Nation is attacking what's left of the Union, how in pre-Columbian times, their ancestors seem to possess magical abilities as well, with the implication being that those who embrace their ancestral culture and spirituality are gifted with supernatural abilities. This is certainly not inherently wrong, and many other indigenous writers have actually written stories with similar premises. Yet once again, the creators produce a sharp division between their indigenous character, yet never develop or explore the meaning or the reasoning behind the division itself. In other words, we're never shown what those quote-unquote traditional beliefs or lifestyles are that allow some characters to possess supernatural powers, but others to not. Is it simply the belief in magic and the power of spirits? No, because everyone in the story accepts that these mystic creatures exist, indigenous or not. Is it a pull away from colonial ideas and how a governing body should act? No, because even the characters who are coded as traditional, like Wolf or even Cheveo, continue to lead and actively perpetuate war for the sake of the liberal nation-state. Does it have to do with genetics? Maybe, but the text is inexplicit and also goes out of its way to tell the audience about the supposed bloodline purity of its non-supernatural indigenous characters. The likely answer is that it's a hodgepodge of various indigenous cultures, religions, and stories, which once again would be fine if done respectfully and an acknowledgement of the source material. However, the lack of explanatory or clear information shows how indigenous imagery and style is being prioritized over actual substance. For example, the Endless Nation uses stacking totem-class warships, an obvious riff, of totem poles, which are an important historical ancestral record for many indigenous peoples from the Pacific Northwest. However, according to the comic's own maps, the Endless Nation is in the Midwest and slightly southwest. And thus, while these Plains and Pueblo indigenous peoples never created totem poles or totem imagery, because they are vastly different cultures with vastly different resources available, totem imagery is still deployed. In being so non-specific and unexplained, a symptom of Hickman's decision to assimilate all of the indigenous characters under one culturally unified identity, the supernatural abilities in East of West comes off as exoticism, mystifying the indigenous characters with seemingly no respect for the culture and religious implications that those powers may have for living Indigenous Americans today. It borrows indigenous imagery where it sees fit, in the fashion, technology, and spirituality, for mainly aesthetic purposes, creating a false dichotomy between traditional and modern indigenous peoples, but one that's rooted in ambiguous aesthetics rather than a spectrum of experiences. And while yes, it is cool to see culturally important and non-Western styles being highlighted as not just present, but also as being technologically superior enough to rival those of their non-indigenous counterparts, this largely just goes to erase the real diversity in American indigeneity, instead favoring a monolithic, mystified indigenous aesthetic, one that's less akin to an authentic self-representation. But perhaps the most interesting thing about East of West Indigenous representation is the way it subverts and reinvests in a fictitious dichotomy between its indigenous characters. As earlier mentioned, throughout the history of Western depiction of Indigenous Americans, be it in films, movies, books, or comics, there's been a long perpetuated division between what kinds of indigenous peoples there are, either a savage or a helpful, civilized Indian. Those coded as being valuable to their white counterparts are deemed acceptable, and often their appreciation is not due to their own indigeneity or personal character strengths, but rather based on how well they emulate Western colonial notions of bravery, loyalty, justice, and more. East of West partially flips this dichotomy on its head, portraying those characters which embody colonial ideas of the importance of technology, advanced nationhood, and a face value civilizedness as actually being the brutal and savage ones in their conquest. These characters, which include members of the Endless Nations Tribal Council, may have been the protagonists in the 1950s, but are now portrayed as the antagonists, being seen as the harbingers of the literal end of the world. In some ways, it partially works as a critique of colonial capitalist liberalism and the realist politics that perpetuate national supremacy and real-world problems like economic inequality, climate change, and more. East of West goes to highlight how these anti-colonial indigenous ideologies, though heavily underdefined and underdeveloped, may present a more harmonious and peaceful world. Yet in doing so, it still portrays its indigenous characters through a dichotomous lens of indigeneity. The revised dichotomy puts old ways and a mysticized spirituality on one end of the spectrum, and the neo-colonial nationalism on the other, making indigenous characters constantly walk the line of which road they want to go down. While this may construct an interesting and commonly represented struggle for urban indigenous peoples who've had their culture alienated from themselves by the US government, the creators have so poorly developed these non-colonial, quote-unquote traditional ways that it's really hard to comprehend what really separates these characters beyond some can do magic and some cannot. A clear example of this internal confusion is the climactic ending of Volume 6, in which Wolf, someone who's coded as having traditional values since the very beginning, who can literally turn into a giant wolf, faces off against a neo-Christian prophet who's trying to bring the end of times. Wolf thus presents an indigenous way of thinking and identity. The prophet, on the other hand, is a literal Western monster representative of a deformed Western religious identity and colonial values, which is, I'll reiterate, literally the living embodiment of the end of times. Unsurprisingly, Wolf prevails, metaphorically representing the triumph of indigeneity over its colonial rival. Yet, rather than expanding on what these quote-unquote traditional beliefs, cultures, and spirituality actually are, in the very next issue, Wolf goes to take control over the tribal council and marches the Endless Nation out to war in the hopes of attaining geopolitical supremacy. What are the creators saying about colonial and indigenous identities? Does American indigeneity need to be co-opted by the liberal state in order to protect indigenous culture? And once again, what are those old ways which divide indigenous characters so starkly in the comic, yet are so easily overlooked by characters as they seek to attain power? We're only left with more questions, and another constructed dichotomy which defines which indigenous characters are good and which indigenous characters are bad, yet with little respect for any actual indigenous religions, spirituality, or ways of knowing. While it's not the blatantly racist dichotomy of the 1950s, it's still problematic in how it portrays indigeneity on a binary defined mainly by colonial ideologies more than any actual identifiable indigenous characteristic. While perhaps innovative in mainstream comics, East of West accidentally mythologizes and exoticizes Indigenous culture and religion, arguably exploiting and distorting Indigenous beliefs and cultures as a wow factor for a non-Indigenous audience, one of the very tenets of Elizabeth Cook Lynn's definition of anti-Indianism. The point is not that East of West fails to create an accurate depiction of indigeneity on the basis of some kind of measurable spectrum of what makes an individual Indigenous or not, but rather the East of West actively reinvest in archetypical identities rooted in aesthetic iconography, proving that the creators haven't done enough cultural and historic research to do these living identities justice. I think it's more productive to acknowledge the need for more Indigenous characters and more Indigenous creators in this medium. By highlighting and publishing more Indigenous authors, a larger, more diverse own voices pool of characters are created, which produce a more accurate mosaic of Indigenous identity rather than just a binary. In the words of Teo Montoya, a member of the Lipan Apache Nation, sci-fi writer and host of the excellent Indigenous Futurism podcast, whose link is in the description.
And as we go about visioning this future, it actually allows us to stake a claim in it. It allows us to create our own narratives, to change the narratives, to reinsert our indigeneity into that narrative, not only for the benefit of ourselves, of our people, but for all of humanity. And if we are to vision clearly, we need not only to tap into the well of our own indigeneity, into our own ancestral ways, into those original teachings that each of our peoples have, but also to deeply critique the colonial capacity to vision the future. So really, we're trying to take this immense privilege we have as modern peoples, as Indigenous peoples, and to use those together to create something new.